Hi everybody, Golden Era Bookworm here today. I'm going to continue with Mike Mentzer's Golden Era series and principles of heavy duty training. Now, heavy duty training, as I've mentioned before, is an abbreviated method of progressive resistance training focusing on gradually increasing the intensity of the workout with the goal of achieving maximum muscle growth in the shortest amount of time possible. Now, in his book that I've been recently reading, Heavy Duty, A Logical Approach to Muscle Building, there's a really good chapter following yesterday's video, and this one is on genetics and individual potential. Now, obviously, this is one of the biggest discussions that we have as bodybuilders, amateurs or competitors, and we obviously can see in this awesome shot of Mike Mentzer in his most muscular that he had phenomenal genetics, and obviously this led to him being such a successful bodybuilder. Let's have a look at his thoughts on genetics and individual potential. So one of the first things an amateur bodybuilder would usually ask when attempting bodybuilding is, how can I know just what my potential is for acquiring larger muscles? And Mike Mentzer answers this in this way. Unfortunately, there is no surefire way to really know. As he puts it, we acquire, for example, facial characteristics, hair color, blood type, etc. from our parents. Very obviously shown here in this photo of the Mentzer brothers, not twins. Ray was actually his younger brother, but we can obviously see that their, for example, their moustache, their dad must have had a super epic, awesome moustache gene, right? Well, I'm just kidding, but the point is that certain characteristics, such as the face, color of the skin, etc., are all inherited from our parents. But it is the genetic profile of the human that determines the muscle growth and bone density, and it is not as easy as just looking at your parents to work out what your potential could be, because most parents obviously they are not trained unless they are an actual athlete. Most average parents are not trainees, and so the same thing actually he discusses is the same thing with intellect. What you actually need, however, is both physical and intellectual stimulation. And in order, therefore, to develop the intellect, as an example, or the physique, especially the musculature, these are largely dependent on environmental influences. Environmental influences, what does that actually mean? Well, we are talking about stimulation or stress. For example, to develop the intellect, one requires intellectual stimulation, while physical stress, on the other hand, would develop the human body in terms of structure, skeletal structure, and muscular development. And this obviously makes a lot of sense. This is why you have people that are geniuses coming from your average, just an average couple that had their child, and their child just becomes a genius. And similarly, if you look at a bodybuilder, most bodybuilders do not necessarily have bodybuilders as parents. Now, Mike states that in order to achieve an above normal intellect or muscular development, one must actually go above the normal demands of the average person who is exposed to just simple everyday living tasks. And in the case of developing increased muscular growth, one must expose the body to increasing levels of high intensity training. You can only expect an improvement when the body has adapted to performing a task. But if you perform this task over and over repetitively, the body simply plateaus in any adaptation. This makes perfect sense. Now, the limits. There are limits, of course. Anyone can improve their intellect or muscular development, but there are limitations, and these limitations, of course, are genetically predetermined by a genetic profile. Along with these psychological factors, which are very important but are another chapter altogether, and these are very necessary for achieving any kind of goal one sets their mind to, the bone structure. It is the skeletal structure of a human being that is the single most important determinant of developing muscle. I mean, metabolism is also important, which we will touch on, but the skeletal structure is of high importance. It is the bones and the joints that form the structure where the muscles actually attach to. Just like, if you have an analogy, just like a strong foundation is necessary to support a very large building, the same is for the human being. This is why only a few become champions, because only a few are born with the correct skeletal structure. The size and the strength of the bones and the strength of the joints dictates how much muscle is actually supported on the skeletal frame, because the muscle simply attaches to it. It makes perfect sense. And it also, that the skeletal structure also determines the aesthetics of the physique at the end. This is determined, of course, by the way the muscles attach to the bone structure as well. Now, Mike's discussion on the skeletal structure is very obvious when we compare these photos, and even the previous photo of Mike doing a press overhead. We can clearly see from these photos of his teens that he had the correct skeletal structure to support massive muscle. It's so obvious from these photos. But when we compare the very small and frail skeletal structure of 70s actor Woody Allen, as well as the other extreme, the tank-like structure of Paul Anderson, we can clearly see how skeletal structure truly affects the amount of muscle one can actually put on. I mean, Woody Allen was not a bodybuilder, but I'm pretty sure that he would never develop a Mr. Olympia physique. It's just, it's obvious. And similarly, Paul Anderson, having his large tank-like structure, probably would never develop an aesthetic physique. A massive physique, yes, but not necessarily aesthetic. Now, the ultimate size of your own muscle is determined by the length of the muscle itself. And this is not necessarily due to the length of the bone. The length of the bone is predetermined, full stop. But it is the length of the tendons where the muscle attaches to the bone that determines the length of the muscle itself, and therefore its ultimate size. Of course, a taller individual having longer bones will have a greater propensity to simply develop much larger muscles overall than a shorter individual. That's obvious that the skeletal structure is just larger, and therefore their ability to develop mass is simply that much greater. But it is very important to consider the length of the tendon as well, because that will actually determine your own individual size of the muscle. That's a very, very important point that Mike Mentzer makes. And I'd just like to read a couple of paragraphs directly from the heavy-duty book from 1970s written by Mike Mentzer. I actually can't put it in better words myself, so I'll just read directly. He actually compares here Lou Ferrigno with Danny Padilla. Examples of muscle lengths which can be easily measured are the biceps brachii. If you were to measure the length, for example, of 6'5" Lou Ferrigno's bicep, you might find it to measure maybe 9 inches in length, while 5'3" Danny Padilla's might only measure 6 inches long. Since Lou's biceps are 50% longer, theoretically, they possess the capacity to develop 2.25 times the transectional area, as well as 3.375 times as much volume as Danny Padilla's biceps. Though Danny and Lou possess long biceps extending the full length of their upper arms, Lou has an advantage in his greater bone length. So he really makes a very important point. I mean, this is obvious when you just look at this photo. The size difference of Lou is just, it is so obvious. But yeah, I really like how clear and how he clarifies this very important topic of individual potential in this chapter. I think it's a very, very good read. Now, finally, Mike Mentzer touches on metabolism and makes some very important points, and I actually make a couple of my own points here as well. Obviously, metabolism is important for the creation of muscle. It's completely responsible for the creation of muscle. The ability to break down a compound, such as those found in food or tissue itself, is called catabolism, while building up a compound such as protein or muscle or any kind of visceral tissue is known as anabolism. So when you have this balance of metabolism with catabolism, this is actually called homeostasis, and this level that is sustained within your body, which is in general terms called metabolism, is going to determine how much muscle you simply create, because it determines how much of the food you can assimilate and therefore create muscle. It makes perfect sense. And of course, not everybody is born with the same metabolic capability. If you've, for example, been training for a year or two and have only seen minimal gains in strength and muscle, then you are probably not geared genetically to become the next Mr. Olympia. I mean, that's obvious. And although this, of course, is determined by the quality of the training program, still, I mean, some people you'll see in the gym, they just start. An example is, for example, for me, my example is my brother-in-law. I mean, he barely had to train. He was huge. He was like tall like Arnold, and I mean, this guy trained barely at all, and he just burst everywhere. He was like 18, 19-inch biceps and completely natural. He was just had the correct skeletal structure and metabolism. So some people are just born with the correct genetics. Now, for example, another example is Mike Mentzer. Is perfect example, as shown in his photos. This is another photo of him early on in his career, where he obviously you can tell he's developed muscle simply because he has the genetics. For example, Mike started off bodybuilding at the age of 12 with only 43 kgs, and after 3 years he had already beefed up 32 kilos. He went up to 75 kilos, 32 kilos in 3 years. That's incredible. And at that stage he could already bench press 170 kilos. So he was obviously born with a propensity of developing an enormous, massive body. My recent video on Mike Mentzer's thoughts about realistic rates of muscular growth, I know I didn't touch on the phenomena that occurs with some novice bodybuilders, and that is that some can easily put on 10 to 20 kgs of muscle when they just start bodybuilding in their first year of training. And this, of course, is also due to several factors. Your genetics, of course. If you're genetically predisposed to put on muscle, you will. And a lot of people just explode, just like I told you with my brother-in-law. But another factor could also be the fact that the person may have suffered from a malaise, some kind of a disease in their life, and maybe the change in nutrition and training program actually helps with this. Another factor there is malnutrition. Some people simply did not consider their nutritional their diets as they were growing up, and suddenly this became a priority when they started training, and suddenly now that they've got a better nutrition and diet, they put on muscle and their whole metabolism changes. So these are also factors that affect muscle growth, and possibly reasons why some people experience enormous amounts of growth in the first year of training. Finally, Mike Mentzer finishes off his chapter with a discussion on psychological factors, which we will cover in a future video. But he does finish off stating this: although one has genetic limitations in both skeletal structure and metabolism, willpower, the unrelenting drive and ambition of a person can also carry them forward. And he gives a perfect example of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, look what he became, the greatest bodybuilder of all time. He didn't have the best genetics, but he had incredible drive and ambition, and that alone can take you a far, far way. And so he makes a very good point there. I hope you've enjoyed this, I know, extensive discussion on genetics and individual potential as brought to you by Mike Mentzer. I've added a little bit myself, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't to the Golden Era Bookworm, leave me a comment, and thank you for watching. This is the Golden Era Bookworm. Bye for now.